Hi, this is Merisa.
And this is Jordan.
And you're listening to This Year in History.
Today, Merisa and I will be covering two topics from the year 1903. What do you have for us today, Merisa?
Today I'm going to be talking about the fire at the Iroquois Theatre in Chicago, Illinois. This happened on December 30th, 1903, and it is actually one of the deadliest, it's actually the deadliest single building fire in U.S. history. When I was reviewing topics to do for this year, for 1903, one of the things that stood out to me was that the theater was advertised as absolutely fireproof. And for me, that seems strange, because if I'm like driving and I see a restaurant and it says "eat here, no rats," it makes me like, not want to eat there, because it's kind of like, well, why are you advertising that?
Yeah.
It seems strange to me. But I actually looked it up, and of course, during that time, there was theater fires were something that happened frequently, because they used like oil lamps, and then the chemicals they were using like for paintings and for scenery. So theaters often caught on fire. So being advertised as absolutely fireproof was actually a good thing at that time. The fire inspector went in and said it is absolutely fireproof. The building chief inspector also went and said everything looked absolutely great. But they were lying. And it actually turned out they rushed opening when it wasn't even done. And the fire inspector and the building inspector were actually both bribed with tickets. So that's why they were publicly saying that it was ready to go. Okay, so the theater opened on November 23rd, and it burned down 37 days later on December 30th. And this was during a winter break, so it was mostly children and women that were at the theater at the time. The capacity for the theater was 1,724, but they actually allowed 2,000 people in at the time, so everyone was sitting, and then the overflow, everyone else was standing. So what happened was that an arc light shorted, and an arc light is one of like the first electrical light bulbs. It's not something that we're used to seeing today. So they weren't as useful or as effective as they are today. So when it shorted, it actually caught a curtain on fire. And this was a huge building. It was 6 feet tall. So it wasn't like a small building, and it had like a 60-foot ceiling. So, and this whole
Did you say
background
6 feet tall?
I'm sorry, 60 feet.
Okay, I heard 6 feet.
Oh, I'm sorry, 60 feet. And so it's a really tall building. It's 6 stories. Oh, I'm sorry. I meant to say 6 stories. So it's a 6-story tall building.
Okay, so it's still 60 feet then?
Yeah, yeah.
All right, 3 different sixes you've said. And you know what that means. All right, so 60 feet. No.
No, the ceiling is 60 feet.
So let's just assume every room is 10 feet, and there's 6 rooms stacked on top of each other.
No, it's just one huge theater where
Okay, got it. All right, cool.
You understand?
No, I got it. It's one giant area that's 60 feet tall, which is equivalent to 6 stories.
No, the ceiling is 60 feet tall.
Okay, where do I get stories from? All right, so when you get inside there,
it's a 6-foot story.
You look up, and from your face to the ceiling,
you're confusing me.
It's about 55 feet, 54 feet, depending on how tall you are.
It's a 6-story building with the 60-foot ceiling.
Got it.
Okay. So the arc light shorted, and it actually caught a curtain on fire. And there was like thousands of square feet of painted canvases. And when the fire started, it looked like it was a glow, and people thought it was like special effects for the play they were watching. And they were actually watching a very popular musical called Mr. Bluebeard, starring Eddie Foyle and Annabelle Whitford. And the performance actually had about 500 people. So it was a huge theater. And so people thought, oh, this is part of the experience, the glow, but it actually wasn't. And so the fire started to get out of hand. And so the actor Eddie Foyle, he tried calming down people, but of course, like, you see a fire, everyone's gonna kind of freak out. So people started kind of rushing towards the doors, and when they did that, when they opened some of the doors and windows, the air came in, which created like
draft, like a backdraft.
Yeah. Yeah, like the movie.
Yeah, that's what I'm thinking of.
That's
like,
what I thought of. Yeah.
the moment oxygen's introduced to a big fire is gonna like nearly explode. Yeah.
And that's so it created like a huge chimney, you know, like with the huge high ceiling that it had.
Yeah.
And the things that we see today in the theaters, like the huge or the very bright exit lights and the doors that are easy to push open, like that wasn't what they had at the time. And the theater that theater was actually kind of a Renaissance theater is how they described it. And so a lot of the exits were covered by curtains because I guess for like the beauty of the theater, they didn't want to have like this ugly exit signs located everywhere, so they covered them. And then on top of that, when they actually found the exit doors, the theater, since it's like a Renaissance theater, the guy who made the theater, he actually put European locks. They're called Basquel locks. And so a lot of people didn't even know how to open them because it involved like the small lever. It's not something that's common in America. So even though they got to the doors,
they couldn't get out.
Yeah. And then some doors were actually even locked because they're trying to prevent people from going to the expensive seats. So they actually locked some doors. So everyone's like going crazy because they're like, what do we do? And people actually started jumping out of the window. And of course they were dying on impact, but then there were so many bodies on the floor that other people that jumped after them, like they were breaking their fall with the bodies that were already on the floor.
So eventually there's a pile of people and the pile got higher.
Yeah.
So
and
before you know, people just stepping out the window and walking down the pile. And
the blaze, it took like 571 lives in 20 minutes.
Whoa.
And there was a curtain. There was supposed to be an asbestos curtain. And this was before asbestos was known to be a carcinogenic. Is that how you say the word?
Carcinogenic.
Yeah. So, but it actually wasn't even made out of that. It turned out that it was actually made out of paper, so it didn't even do anything. There was like nothing there, and even like they said like the fire extinguishers at that time were also ineffective. The ones that they had at the theater, and so many people, like what they said, the bodies were stacked like 10 feet high or 6 feet high. Oh, here we go with the 6 feet again. Yeah, so like bodies were stacked like very, very high.
Yeah.
And like in 20 minutes, almost 600 people died. Eventually, the death total came to 602 because people that went to the hospital eventually died. And so you're kind of wondering, well, who went to jail for this? Because everyone was lying, right? So the only person who actually went to jail was a guy who owned a saloon next door, and they were using his saloon as a makeshift morgue because there were so many bodies, and he was stealing wallets out of the dead people.
Oh.
But the fire inspector and the building inspector, and the mayor of Chicago, they all had charges brought against them, but then they were all dismissed. So like nobody went to prison for lying about this building being ready to go.
So it was a brand new building, right?
Yeah, it was open only for 37 days.
Yeah,
and they rushed
insane.
everything. So it wasn't even ready to go.
It sounds like so did you mention there was a fire marshal in the beginning?
A fire inspector?
Fire inspector. They didn't have fire marshals then, right?
I don't think so. Maybe that was the equivalent of a fire marshal.
Yeah, they just make sure they're safe and ready to go. So they do have to give approval before you can open a business, right? Mm-hmm. The fire inspector?
Yeah, and they were bribed, so...
Oh. Well, it's kind of like the way things are now. Like bridges that aren't complete and they take shortcuts and then it collapses and then companies get sued and then there's inspectors that didn't do their job. And it seems like it's a common thing and even worse at that time. And
like the actors, they actually made it out okay because they actually had an exit on the stage. So all of the actors made it out okay. I think like 2 ushers died, but the majority were women and children that were there to see the show.
I imagine it's kind of like a typical theater setup, kind of like how we have like the Majestic, where it's like bowl shaped, and the seating is all on one side, and then you got the stage, and the stage has a back door, and then
it's not like a movie theater. Yeah, it's like a where you go to see plays.
That's insane that they covered up the exit signs.
Yeah, and it was just because it didn't look right. It didn't look pretty.
Yeah, but you think that is what kind of sparked the regulations we have today?
Yeah. This was actually the reason why we have the rules that we have today. And like the doors at the time, they would open inward. And you know how nowadays you just push the lever and it goes outward. So the doors were like the opposite.
So so if 600 people are trying to get out the door, they keep closing it. It's a silly design when you think of it, because you've got like 600 people trying to rush out one door, and they have to keep pulling the door back. And then you got the pressure of all these people pushing towards to get the door, closing the door. Yeah. That seems like it would have been common sense, but I guess that's just the way it was designed.
What they did, I don't know. I don't even know how they got away with filling 2,000 people. What was it, like 300 over than what they're allowed to fill in that theater?
You mentioned something earlier about in a restaurant that says we don't have rats. Like, why would you say that? It's kind of like, today, the people are still doing that. Like you look at like a soy milk thing, or like any sort of groceries that say gluten free. Like, it's always been gluten free for thousands of years. It's just, if we put this on there, people are gonna buy this because it doesn't have gluten, and there's a lot of And also now it's like essential jobs, because we're in the quarantine days, 2020. You have businesses now saying contactless. Have you seen that? Like, we're a contactless business, which means
they don't make contact.
Yeah, they don't make contact with anyone, and they wear masks, and it's weird how like we're still doing that today, 100 so years later, with the whole
and the Titanic was also advertised as unsinkable.
Yeah.
So whenever like something is advertised as like this isn't going to happen, it seems like it happens.
Yeah, if it's got a finite definition of what they're not, then it puts that thought in your mind, like, well, it could be.
Yeah, and it was till this day, it's the largest single building fire and the largest theater fire in American history.
Well, very good. Do you have anything else you want to add to that?
No, that's about it. What are you going to talk about today?
Today, I'm talking about the Kishinev, and I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing it, Kishinev Pogrom of 1903. Now, you might ask, what's a pogrom? Marissa, what is a pogrom?
I don't know what that is.
Have you heard that word before?
I've never heard that word before.
Okay, well, the dictionary's definition of a pogrom is an organized massacre of a particular ethnic group, in particular that of Jews in Russia or Eastern Europe. So it's a word that came from Russia. Now, in Russia, it actually translates directly to wreak havoc. If you're the originator of a Jewish oppression, you're not very nice. So Russians in the late 1800s, early 1900s had several pogroms. Now, there's a lot of anti-Semitism all over the place, but primarily in Russia at this time. Now, you got to think this is even before World War I. Mm-hmm. The first one they had was actually in 1881, after anti-Semitic violence erupted following the assassination of Tsar Alexander II. Now, this was in Kishinev, which is kind of eastern Russia, like bordering Romania, and it's now modern-day Moldova, which is right between Romania and Ukraine. What happened here, Kishinev wasn't really known. Nobody really knew where it was. It was half populated with Jews. Now, during Passover in 1903, the Jews were blamed for the deaths of 2 children. Now, there were these 2 children that died on separate occasions, and what they tried to say was like they took these kids and sacrificed them, or one of them at least.
Is it that the blood libel?
Yes, exactly. And so they did that for Passover. So for the Christians, it was Easter, like right before Easter Sunday. So it was April 19th. And so on that day, as the Christians were being released, and a lot of Catholics, right? A lot of priests, a lot of Christian people, and they were mainly Catholic, hated the Jews, like openly hated the Jews. They would say things because they're different, because they're not Catholic, and you know how it is. So there's actually one priest who's like kind of advocating for the death of Jews, and even said, bring death to the Jews. And there's even before that, there were publishers in newspapers talking about Jewish people, such as death to the Jews and crusade against the hated race, which is a very normal thing for journalists in Russia during that time. Now, I'm going to pronounce this terribly because I'm not versed in Russian at all, but I'm going to try it. I think it's called the Bessarabets. The Bessarabets paper was the main paper they were reading at the time in that town. And so because of this, the priests began this riot. And In the beginning, it was, a few damaged buildings and all that, and it wasn't too bad. But this went on for about 3 days. So day one, people got out of church, and I guess their sermon was the Jews were evil or whatever it was. I don't know. But they came out of church angry, wanting blood from the Jews. The Jews were blamed for so many things. Now, the Jewish people, they are hated for their success, as you might know, like throughout history. There's negative and positive stereotypes about Jews, being all about business and making money, working together. And so they went to this small town in Russia, and they were succeeding. Now, they were opening shops, things like that. So they were with a bunch of like what you call peasants, or just regular common folk with Russian people. Now, these people are working together. They're helping themselves, because that's what they do. And they were having successful businesses and stuff like that. And it seems like everyone wants to blame another race or another type of people when they begin failing as a people. Like, current day situation would be something like, the Mexicans are taking all our jobs, right? Because they suck at their job. So they blame it on the Mexicans about they can't work or whatever because their job got closed down. Everyone wants to blame someone else. And in this time, it was the Catholics in Russia blaming the Jews. Seems like a common theme.
Yeah, whenever like the economy isn't going great or people's lives aren't going great, they want to put a face on what's the cause of their problems.
Yeah.
And there's always people in higher positions to inflame that.
And it's never themselves. They never blame it on themselves. Yeah. Like they just suck as a person and they picked the wrong line of work. Or, I've been we've been coal miners for 5 generations. Well, maybe look for another job. Maybe
there's nothing wrong with being a coal miner.
There's nothing wrong with being a coal miner. But if it's a job that's not, if it's a dying field, then maybe you want to break the cycle and invest into...
Yeah, but if there's nothing else around and you make $100K a year being a coal miner, how are you going to...
Well, if they're making $100K a year, they have nothing to complain about. They're doing well, right?
Yeah, but if there's nothing else around and their place of employment is going out of business...
Well, I believe in natural selection, and if, things are evolving for the best, you make changes in your life and your career. I've had to do that several times. We talked about that in the last episode when I was a projectionist, and now we don't have that job anymore because it's all digital. You have to adapt and evolve. My opinion. That's another topic though. But back to this. So pretty much they caused these riots and started destroying houses and anything Jewish related, their businesses, smashing up their properties. And by the end of all of this, it resulted in 49 murders, hundreds of rapes, and hundreds of homes destroyed, and over 500 people severely injured. So there's pictures I found on this, and we'll post that to the social media accounts. But 700 houses, now these are all estimates, so 700 houses were destroyed, and 600 stores were pillaged. So that was pretty much the end result after the 3 days of riots. Now, this made it to news in the United States. It made it to the New York Times, and the Jewish people in the United States found out about this, and that's how this spread like wildfire, like for news throughout the whole world. So this is like the major pogrom that happened to put that word on the map. Now, most of this information I found, because it's really difficult to find detailed information on this when it's in another country, far away, so the documents are different. So the records, and not only that, you're going to get a very biased record of what happened. You have to hear it from both sides. Mm-hmm. So there's one man, his name is Steven Zipperstein. He's an American author who wrote mostly about this. He's got a couple of books on this. He does presentations. So 80% of the information I found on the internet came from this man.
But does he have a bias as well?
I'm sure he does. But I think because of his fascination with his Jewish history and his culture, he's going to research this. Of course, this could be biased. Everything could be biased. But it's the most accurate information I found. Now, I'm not saying that because if you say the bias, that means, the Jewish people were not innocent. No, I mean, they were living their lives and they were conflicted. They didn't start this. They didn't want this. Eastern Europe, pretty much a lot of Europe, the hatred for Jews was a common theme.
I'm sorry. Is that why people, I guess somebody like Hitler, it was easy for him to say the things he said because it was something that was accepted like worldwide?
Yeah, I wouldn't say worldwide.
To have that hate?
Oh, for sure.
So how did it end?
It ended with people dying, news spreading, and pretty much over time, a lot of the Jews from that town left because they're being oppressed so much because of this. Now, the same thing happened just a year later. I don't want to go too much into that because that's a different year, I'm trying to stick with the 1903. It put this topic in the eyes of the world. Like everybody was now seeing the oppression towards Jews, especially in Russia. Now, there were more pogroms all the way until World War II. Now, even World War II, that Kristallnacht, that's considered a pogrom. Any sort of oppression for Jews. But the Russians kind of coined that term, of course. It's a Russian term. So they began it, the extreme oppression of Jews and the massacres and the killings. It was popularized in Russia and carried on into Germany, into World War II.
In modern times.
Even to now,
right?
yeah. You can now have a new pogrom today if there was one. Now, there's another one too in Uganda, which is another story as well. But there's a lot of stories, even, like the Uganda crisis, even in the 90s, there's a lot like that too. And some people call it a pogrom. You remember that movie Hotel Rwanda, things like that. It was the same kind of thing. They call it genocide. But like I said in the beginning, the definition of a pogrom is an organized massacre of a particular ethnic group. But they usually talk about Jewish people in Russia or Eastern Europe as kind of primarily how they use that term.
So since the world was focused on it, or they were being informed about it, did that kind of shame them to stop, or were they like, I don't give a hoot, this is what I'm
I don't
do.
think they got shamed. I don't think they felt shame. I think
they felt like they were right.
Yeah, whatever belief they had, they kind of stuck to that. Yeah, like I said, it wasn't like the biggest pogrom. People want to put in quotes, only 49 people were killed. But it was one of the biggest milestones. Kind of like the Columbine shooting. It wasn't the biggest one that happened, but it was the one that got everyone's attention. Yeah. And it kind of, there were shootings before that. There were school shootings before Columbine, but for some reason, Columbine is like what we think of when we think of school shootings. That's like the big first one, right? So it's kind of like the equivalent of that. And, sorry?
No, go ahead.
I heard you inhale. So that's pretty much it. That's the story. I really couldn't find too much on this, but there's plenty of books by Steven Zipperstein is the author of all these books, and he's got a few books on that too. I also want to talk about the American response to that. Okay, so as you know, fake news has been in existence since the beginning of news, right? This was one of them in the New York Times. I'm going to quote a little bit and briefly talk about some of it, but it says, the mob was led by priests, and the general cry, "Kill the Jews," was taken up all over the city. The Jews were wholly unaware and slaughtered like sheep. The dead number, 120, right? So it's different than the 49, and injured about 500. The scenes of horror attending this massacre are beyond description. Babies were literally torn into pieces by the frenzied and bloodthirsty mob. The local police made no attempt to check the reign of terror. At sunset, the streets were piled with corpses and wounded. Those who could make their escape fled in terror, and the city is now practically deserted from Jews. Now, that wasn't really true. I don't know, maybe there was a baby that was torn to pieces. Maybe that happened once, but it wasn't like they were just like ripping babies' limbs off and killing 120 people. So they dramatically exaggerated the facts of what happened. This is New York Times in 1903. So even then, they had fake news.
Yes, the New York Times. I wonder if it was difficult for him to do that research, because I don't imagine, like, even in modern times, like you don't know what's going on in Russia.
Yeah.
You kind of have to make out by the little bit that they give you. So I don't know, in that time, if it was, even more difficult to have things documented accurately.
Completely correct. Yeah. It's tough. I mean, our job is tough trying to find information on this, because I've spent days on getting up this little bit of information. The more time goes by, the more information we'll have because of, records and documents. But that's my story.
So what else happened in 1904? Oh, wait, 1903.
We're still in 1903. We are.
Yeah, I'm in my time machine. Henry Ford launches the Ford Motor Company. Ford Model A is produced.
What else have you got?
The Wright brothers make the first ever man-powered airplane flight in the USA.
Now, if we did that topic, what would we say? We talk about how would we tell that story? Because it's kind of a fact. Do we talk about the origins, the trials and errors?
Probably the trials and errors. Yeah. I would go with that.
The legal, because you got to think, in that time, were there any, like, what do they call them? I'm trying to think of the word, aviation laws. There we go.
No, there was not.
Yeah, they didn't have them, so they had to pretty much come up with them during time.
Ooh, there was another fire in the world, and Paris metro fire kills over 100 people.
Okay, let me see if I can find something. Keep going, though.
The invention of Crayola crayons.
Oh, did it have the same smell?
They smell?
Yeah, you don't like the smell of Crayola crayons?
I don't think I've ever smelled them.
The first Tour de France bicycle was held.
Oh, really?
Yeah, and Maurice Garwin wins it. That one's
Congratulations.
interesting. The British take over the Fulani Empire. Not familiar with that, but there you go. Some information there.
The Women's Trade Union League is formed in the US of A.
The Taj Mahal Palace Hotel in Bombay, India opens its doors to guests in December 16th.
Ooh. Niels Feinson receives Nobel Prize for his use of phototherapy for skin diseases. That's interesting.
It is. The first African-American woman to charter a bank in November 2nd that year.
I think that's all I got.
Oh, here's one that might be interesting. Texas State University in San Marcos, Texas opens its doors as Southwest Texas Normal School. They're pretty modest. I know a few people.
We'll end it on that.
Yeah, I know a few people that went there. So
I went to the normal school.
You graduate from Southwest Texas Normal School, I see. All right. I want to do an interview for someone like that. Anyway.
I didn't go to the dumb one.
I went to the normal one. We're pretty modest. We just pay what we feel. All right.
Well, we'll see you in 1904.
See you in 1904. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.